I am excited to welcome our next guest for a little fireside chat. Joining us on stage, we are going to have Todd Rose, who is the president of Populace and previously a professor at Harvard. And joining him, we have GSV's own Michael Moe, founder and CEO, as well as Deborah Quazzo, GSV Ventures co-founder and managing partner, and also a fantastic mother, I've heard, but I wouldn't know anything about that personally. So now, please welcome the three of them on stage for their fireside chat.
All right, good morning. This is a new format for us. Michael and I have never done this together, so we might kill each other here on stage, so apologies for that. We'll see.
I'm here to keep score.
Excellent.
Actually, I think we have some type of clause that doesn't allow us to sit next to each other. But here we go.
Anyway, we are thrilled to be here this morning with Todd Rose, who are our dear friend and sort of game-changing, I'm going to call you a philosopher, writer, thinker, leader. You know, he's the author of Square Peg, the author of End of Average, two extraordinary books if you haven't read them. And he's got a new book coming out in February, and we'll have a little surprise about that for the ASU+GSV audience. And that book is something he wrote during the pandemic, which made the pandemic very productive for him. And the title of the book is Collective Illusions. And what I love about the way Todd approaches things is you're a consummate storyteller, right? You use the power of stories to bring forth, important revelations about different things. And so I'd like to open it up, have you comment on Collective Illusions from the perspective of the Elm Hollow research and Mrs. Salt, if you don't mind. I have been fortunate enough to get a little sneak peek at the galley based on that.
Well, yeah, this will be the story of Elm Hollow is my favorite. What I like to tell people is the most important study you've never heard of, and every time I say that, my wife says, "You sound like an academic." So exciting, right? But here's what it is. 100 years ago, it was one of the first studies on public opinion ever done, and it was done by a guy named Richard Schenck. And he did it in this small little town that he called Elm Hollow in upstate New York. And the reason he went and lived there, because he felt like if we were going to understand how people form opinions, you might want to live with people and kind of get to know how they interact with each other. So he goes to this tiny little town in upstate New York, and he lives there. And the first thing that he does when he gets to town is he asks everyone, there's 3,000 people, to take a survey, right? The guy goes door to door. "Hi, I'm your new neighbor. Can you take a survey?" Right? In 1930. And he collects it. And he did he was so exhaustive. It was what's your views of national politics and small town life? And because in Elm Hollow, almost everybody was the same religion, he had this whole section called Church Attitudes. And he's asking about everything the authority of the pastor, all the way down to their views on prohibitions against drinking and smoking. And as someone who grew up in rural Utah, that kind of piqued my interest, right? And so I said, so he gets these results. And he's like, well, this is weird. Everybody seems to have the same opinion on almost everything. And for example, on the prohibitions, he says, he realizes 90% of people are oh yeah, definitely, we don't drink and we don't smoke. We definitely don't do that. And then he writes here, within a year, he said, yeah, except for I personally have drank and smoked with almost every adult in Elm Hollow in the privacy of their own home.
Including the pastor.
Including the pastor. That's exactly right. Including the pastor. So he gets really curious about this because at the time everyone thought, look, public opinion is going to save democracy. And he was like, well, wait a minute. They may not, what they're saying may not be what they actually do. That's a problem. And he tries to figure it out, and this is something he does, which I think is genius, and it leads to the work that we do at Populace in part, is he's trying to figure out why. Why are they such hypocrites? And he does this great thing, which is he decides to give everyone the same survey again. Only this time, instead of asking them for their personal views again, which he already knows, he asked this question that I think forever is a game changer. He asked them, what do you think most people in Elm Hollow would say? And what he finds out is that people of Elm Hollow are just ridiculously wrong about the people of Elm Hollow. So like on those prohibitions, it turns out the overwhelming majority of people were like, yeah, I think everyone in Elm Hollow doesn't drink or smoke, which of course that wasn't true, right? They all were. Anyway, so to make a long story shorter, he's like, this is a problem. How could they be so wrong about each other? And then he figures out, he stays in Elm Hollow for an additional 2 years to try to figure this out. And he arrives at the answer, and this is, it turns out, everybody's going along with views, like say with drinking, smoking, and a bunch of other things that nobody wanted, except for one person. And it was a woman named Mrs. Salt. And so this is why I love the research. We don't do it this way anymore. 100 years ago, it's like, let me tell you about Mrs. Salt in my dissertation. She was one of the oldest residents in Elm Hollow. And her dad was the former pastor. And she was, cancel culture is a little strong, but she had strong views. And she didn't mind sharing them. And she was widely known to basically call anybody out who stepped out of line with what she thought was appropriate, right? And so what Schenck figures out is that because she's very, very outspoken and everybody else doesn't want to be made a public spectacle, so they're not saying anything, the people of Elm Hollow kind of succumbed to her views because they thought she spoke for the majority. And so they were all under what we call a collective illusion, right? And so they're just like stuck. Anyway, it has a good ending, but it was crazy because Schenck was one of the first to show us two things that I think are really important for where we are in America today, even. The first is that like what people say out loud isn't necessarily what they really think, which I think is pretty obvious now. But the second thing is just how easily a small vocal fringe, even a single person, can sometimes even inadvertently misrepresent and mislead the whole group.
So, and I've had the privilege of reading your research, and I think it's so important that people appreciate this because, you know, we're at a time and place in the country and the world that feels like, you know, everything's gone crazy and everybody's on extreme opposite ends, and there's no common ground. What does your research actually show about today? So I mean, this collective illusions talks about just how the brain's wired, but what does your research talk about? Show us today.
Yeah, what's interesting is you could imagine that the idea that the majority could be wrong about the majority would be like an anomaly, like a one-off. And at Populace, what we do in part is what we call private opinion research, right? We use methods that get around social pressure, other things, to try to get an accurate read on people's private views. And following in the footsteps of Schenck and others, we always ask that extra question on everything, like not just what you think, but what do you think most people think? And what's been so shocking is that almost everywhere we look in America today, we are just spectacularly wrong about each other. It's true in terms of what we want out of education, both K-12 and higher ed. It's true what we want out of criminal justice. It's true about even our definition of success, like a successful life. And most recently, about 6 months ago, we published the American Aspirations Index, which was one of the largest studies ever on what people want for the future of the country. And what was pretty shocking, and look, I'm okay, like I would prefer we all get along, but I'm okay if we're divided for real, because at least we can deal with that. But we have to have an accurate understanding of each other. And what was so shocking to me, and we did it 3 different times, this massive survey, because it just felt like, so when we asked these people to come and partake in this survey of thousands and thousands of people, the first thing we asked them, just before we did the private opinion methods, we just asked them, do you think we're more divided or united as a country? 82% of respondents said we're more divided, and half of those people said we are extremely divided. What was worse, when you just cut it by who you voted for in the last election, a majority of all voters said that the other side doesn't share their values for the future of the country. And yet, when you put them into private opinion methods that force trade-offs and you can't game it, it tells a completely different story. There are things that we are divided on as a country, immigration being one of them. That's just privately we are really divided. But that pales in comparison to the incredible amount of unity that we see. So for example, out of 55 trade-off priorities for what our country could be, across all demographics, if you just look at the top 10, the most highest aspirations across all demographics, all of them, we share 8 in common. So to me, I feel like, look, we can handle unity, we can handle differences. What we can't handle is being so spectacularly wrong about each other.
How do we change it?
So, as I say in my book, no, I'm just kidding. My publisher makes me say that 3 times on stage. No, the idea is, that's one, so keep tab. Look, the problem with collective illusions is that we're doing it to ourselves. It's a particular function of how our brains are wired. And I feel like unless we understand that and we understand how we fall into this sort of blind conformity that we're so susceptible to, we'll keep tumbling into these illusions. And the worst part about collective illusions is literally we all end up doing things that most nobody wants, all because we think everybody wants it. And again, it seems crazy, but it is all over the place right now in this country.
So talk about the modern misassault and what you know, social media and what is going on, and how does that you know influence just basically what people feel and are doing.
Well, let me take one step back to make sense of that. Is if you want to know how collective illusions form, you just have to know 2 things about how your brain works. Like, first, we have a conformity bias. It is shocking when you put people in a scanner and you look at their brain. Like, we have evolved to care a lot about being with the majority. No kidding. Whether we're studying food preferences or facial attractiveness or more important things, anytime you give a response that you know or you believe goes against the group, your brain triggers what we call an error signal. It literally is telling you you're wrong and do something about it. It's a mistake. And when your response is aligned to the group, or you believe it is, you get what's called a reward signal, which is literally like the source of pleasure, right? So we are wired to care about being with the group. We all are, in varying degrees. There's just one small problem with that. We are spectacularly terrible at actually judging the group. Our brains are really bad. Like, you should never trust your brain's estimate of the group because it does this shortcut to save energy. This is no kidding. You'd think for how important this is, you're hardwired to conform, you'd be so awesome at knowing exactly what the group cares about. The shortcut is so bad. The loudest voices, repeated the most, are the majority. That's it.
Mrs. Salt.
Mrs. Salt, right? Now here's the problem. If you look at today's social media, which by the way, I'm a fan, like I love the technology, so this is not an anti-technology rant. We've got to understand what our technologies are doing to us and adjust. If you look at social media, estimates are that 80% of all content on social media is generated by 10% of the users. And according to Pew, that 10% isn't remotely representative of the rest of America.
Thank God.
Right? They tend to be more extreme on almost all social views, right? And but you can see the problem, right? So if only 10% of people in the country hold an opinion, but you think it's 80%, your brain is going to automatically assume that is the majority, and unless you're willing to stand up against it, which most people aren't, you're either going to self-silence or even go along with it just to belong. And we end up here in this place where we're all doing things that nobody really wants to do.
Crazy. To take on another tangent topic that we talked about in our prep is sort of the topic of the zero-sum game. Love to get your thoughts and actually how society looks at zero-sum. How do we change that, and the impacts for education?
Yeah, this is my the most important issue to me. The thing I care the most about. The reason Populace exists is I think the biggest collective illusion we're under that is harming us to no end is we believe that other people believe the world has to be zero-sum. Somebody has to lose, right? And here's what's interesting. We have studied this every which way. We have done so much research on people's worldviews on this. And I can tell you for sure that the overwhelming majority of Americans across all demographics privately do not believe that. They don't want that to be true. They don't understand, like, why does somebody have to lose for me to win? Okay? We're talking like close to 70% of the American public. Here's the problem. They think they're a 5% minority. They think 95% of their fellow citizens, of our fellow citizens, think the world is zero-sum. Now, the problem is, if you know anything about behavioral economics, is if you're interacting with other people who are playing a zero-sum game, you're a fool not to play a zero-sum game. You will be taken advantage of. So we all end up behaving as though you're all out to get me, so I got to take care of me. But meanwhile, that's the signal I'm giving to you, which then reinforces the illusion. And for me, I actually think the culprit, this wasn't accidental, right? The architecture of our industrial system was created by people who genuinely thought the world was zero-sum. People like Frederick Taylor, who invented scientific management. You know, even the Edward Thorndike, the father of educational psychology, just really believed, look, not everyone can succeed. They just don't have the brain power. And so we're trapped in a system, and this is why I always like to be here, and I love to hear about Arizona State and these places, and Southern New Hampshire University that's like, wait, this is nonsensical, right? Like, we're playing a game in higher ed that is basically like a Louis Vuitton model of opportunity, right? Quality is judged by how few people we educate. Like, how absurd is that? It's just ridiculous, right? And so, to me, when you think about the fact is, it is absolutely empirically true that the world is not zero-sum, right? That's what free markets showed us, properly regulated, all the way back to Adam Smith. Up until free markets, the richest countries in the world at the time, which usually were England most of the time, never once produced enough food to feed themselves. We produced more material abundance since then than arguably than in human history before it, right? So we know at a material level we can produce abundance, but then you go on the psychological side, the human flourishing, the happiness, and we keep acting as though somehow not everyone can be successful, not everyone can flourish. If your kid's getting an opportunity, that must mean my kid isn't. And it's just nonsensical. And I think for me, if we can get over that hump and realize that we all want to and believe in positive sum societies, we can get somewhere that is like truly spectacular as a country in the world.
And amen. I mean, so important. And the good news, other than just kind of spouting things off like I do, you actually have the research to back it up.
Oh, I spout things too. It's kind of, don't take that away from me.
So talk about education for a second. What does the research talk about what most people think and want in education versus what the perceived value is?
So I'll start with K-12. So we did private opinion, trade-off priorities for parents and the public, including as well as general sentiment before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and as we're kind of coming, well, hopefully, or we're in the middle of it, I don't know. Here's what's so interesting. If I could sum up where the country is in terms of education is they want different, not better. And I think this is really, really important because people, we keep trying to sell them a better mousetrap. And then we're puzzled when they're like, yeah, we don't care. Like, I promise you, like, when you look at what they want to focus on practical outcomes, the whole child, right? They don't want this narrow focus. And what I think is really interesting is how committed the public is to the recognition that every kid is distinct. And that doesn't mean selfishness, right? That's like the heartbeat of community. That's the heartbeat of fulfillment and contribution. And this sense that education should be about the cultivation of that distinctiveness. And I always have to say, every time I talk like that, I'm always worried that it suggests a certain political bent. But in fact, if you want to read the best paper on individuality in education ever written, John Dewey wrote it. And nobody accused John Dewey of being center-right, So like his argument was, if you think about in a democracy, what possible justification do you have to compel parents to drop their kid off at a school? Like, we take it for granted that we do that, but that's actually pretty controversial, that we can compel you. And unless you have the money, we'll be like, and it's this school. I promise you, if we did that with like your mechanic, everybody would riot, right? So look, it's fine, but Dewey's point was that if we're gonna do that, and it looks like we need to, the only justification is that we are committed to the full development of every single child, period. And unless we were willing to do that, it's not okay. And now, of course, for the last 100 years, that's not what we've done, right? We've played this game of false scarcity and almost like a Hunger Games of education where some kids can, thrive and the other kids don't, and then we blame the kids when they don't.
Classic.
You have a bunch of questions here. I'm just kind of,
You go riff. You go ahead.
talk about cancel culture, because I think it's so important, actually, in terms of what's going on. And what's your view of that, and what do you do to change that? Because it's going to, I believe cancel culture is going to kill what's made, innovation and free thinking, such a vital thing for how we go ahead.
Yeah, here's funny. I have a complicated view of it, right? Which is some aspects of what we call cancel culture it really is just accountability, right? It really is holding people responsible for some pretty terrible, well, I was about to say, I haven't been around people where I was going to use words I'm not supposed to say. Okay, pretty terrible things, and I want that to continue. I'm glad Harvey Weinstein's in
Yes.
like more of that, please, right? That'd be great. What I think we've realized with our technologies is that what we really want and what they do is they actually do give everybody a voice. That's really important. But if we don't remember some pretty fundamental principles about what make free societies flourish, what make free markets function, which is you are always challenging the status quo, right? It means that people have to be able to express views that are different than mainstream. Sometimes even things that we might feel like are uncomfortable, right? That's not something to shout down, that's something to debate and discuss. And I think that, truthfully, historically, every time we've had a major technological innovation that has fundamentally changed society, it's been a pretty big net negative for a little while until we realize there's always some mindset or skill that human beings have to adopt to make it worth it. For example, passenger trains. Something as simple as that. German authorities tried to ban them because everyone got vertigo, right? And they were like, this is unnatural. Human beings should not be traveling this fast. And then someone said, well, wait a minute. How about you just don't stare right out the window, right? Look at the distance and ta-da, right? No, very little vertigo. More profound, think about the leap we made from spoken word, oral tradition, to the written word. Remember, Socrates, if you believe Plato, said, hey, look, this is going to ruin memory, which if it means reciting Homer, that was probably true, right? But the idea was that if you could write things down, boy, wouldn't that be amazing? And it's true, right? If you're literate. If you don't have the skill of literacy, that's not a very good trade-off at all, right? And so not surprisingly, the powerful hoarded that skill up until about the Reformation in the West, right? So when I look at this now, I think our social media technologies are going to be vital to a healthy, functioning democracy and a general free society. But we have to recognize that the critical skill and the mindset that we have is not new. It is doubling down on some pretty fundamental American values. And I don't mean that as, nowadays if you say I don't mean anything more than the bedrock of our declaration and things like that, which is like free speech, right? Respect for other people. Can I put a finer point on that? In our Aspirations Index, people didn't want unity. They literally prioritized for the future of the country. A top priority was to treat other people with respect.
Awesome.
But that was a top, I think it was like 12 or 14 out of 55. They thought it was like in the 40s. They thought other people didn't care about it. So we've got the fundamental foundations, technologically, resource-wise, and the great diversity of our society to make this an incredible century. right? But we've got to recognize what our technologies are doing to us, and we've got to adapt and take advantage of that.
And we need social trust, to your other point.
Yeah, that's the last piece, right? Like at the end of the day, like none of this works if we don't actually trust each other. And almost saying that sounds naive. Like, how do you trust? Have you seen people, right? We studied what people care about, their trade-off priorities for a successful life. You would be surprised that being trustworthy was number 3 out of 76 possible trade-off priorities in general. People care a lot about being trustworthy. When you ask them privately, like how trustworthy they can be to make decisions in their life, 90-something% of Americans are like, oh, of course, I can. What about other people? Oh, no, not other people, right? Those 90-something% that say they're trustworthy only think about 30% of the American public is trustworthy. So obviously that can't be true. Either they're lying to us or they're lying to themselves. But if we don't trust each other, which means being vulnerable to each other, the only other alternative is we try to control each other. And like societies don't work when you try to control each other, right? So we've got to get back to that place. And it will feel vulnerable, it'll feel difficult, but I promise you, if we are willing to do that, like this is going to be an incredible century. It really is.
Yeah, if we can all leave here preaching trust, that would be a great thing.
So in the 34 seconds we have left, what one thing would you like to leave our audience with in terms of things that they should be thinking about or they can do to move ahead?
Look, this will sound like preaching to the choir, but all the social change we want in the world isn't possible without education, right? It just isn't. You cannot fix on the back end. You can, it's just really expensive and time consuming and doesn't always work. Much better to realize that education is the lifeblood of democracies, it's the lifeblood of free societies, of free markets. And the thing is that recognizing that the American public in particular wants you to do what you're doing. It wants something different. It's just stuck under an illusion that it doesn't, the American public literally thinks that a supermajority of Americans really like the status quo in education. So nothing's going to change unless we puncture the illusion and that we show people a better way forward. To show people a better way forward is your responsibility. So I'm really glad you're here.
Fantastic. And one quick last announcement. We're happy to announce that all ASU+GSV attendees virtually and live will be receiving Todd's book in February, which we're delighted to be able to send to everybody. So
I guess you didn't see there's 1 million people online right now. But
what?
I guess you didn't see that there's 1 million people online right now.
That'll be a big, you can pay for that.
You just made the promise. I don't know what. But which is awesome. And just the last thing I'll say. I think what Todd is doing is so not only interesting and compelling, but vital for our future. So I'll just make one more statement, which is please, please, please pay attention, get engaged. It's fundamentally critical.
You can go to the Populace website to see all their research.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.